Hello again. I'm Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is History 321, Louisiana History. All right. Um, what we ended video one by talking about the first attempts to establish a colony in what is now uh, Louisiana, and I think one of the last things we mentioned was the proprietorship of Crozat, how it became a financial burden on him, and he wanted to unload it, and so he requested of the King of France, who by that time was Louis XV, that that Louisiana revert to uh, royal ownership, and his request was granted. Okay, so now, and that happened in 1717, by the way. Okay, now it's time to talk about John Law. John Law was a Scottish. John Law was a lot of different things. John Law was uh, he was a Scot. He was a Scot. He was a gambler. He was a banker. He was an adventurer. And many Louisiana historians are convinced that next to Iberville and Bienville, Law did more to help Louisiana grow than anyone during the colonial period. Law um, took over Louisiana. When Crozat gave it back, Law got it from the French king. And he organized Louisiana and ran it through an organization called the Company of the West. So Louisiana was turned over to Law and the Company of the West. By the way, the name of the Company of the West, that name later changed to the Company of the Indies. Basically the same thing, just under a different name. And Law was a pretty savvy businessman. As early as the early 1700s, Law understood the value of advertising. And so Law knew that in order for the Louisiana colony to flourish, it simply had to have more people. And so he began to advertise Louisiana. The problem, of course, was he advertised it as a paradise, which it certainly was not. So what am I saying? I'm saying very clearly he misled the people who would come to Louisiana. Settlers did respond, by the way, to this advertising. Um, Law was able to encourage his friends and his business associates to buy stock in the Company of the West, with the hope that the value of the stock would increase. And so when they sold their stock, the difference between what they paid for it and what they got for it would be a nice fat profit. But Law, to make a very long story, and it is a very long story, to make a very long story short, Law was unable to pay the dividends on the stock, and the company went bankrupt. The Company of the West, which became the Company of the Indies, was bankrupt. And that that entire scheme in the history books is referred to as the Mississippi Bubble. All right, the Mississippi Bubble. And when the bubble popped, the French government takes over Louisiana again, and this time they call our old friend Bienville and make him the governor again. So he's the governor for the second time after the proprietorship of John Law. All right. So let's continue talking about Louisiana as a French colony. Now, Bienville's dream had always been to build the capital city of Louisiana on the banks of the Mississippi River, the lower Mississippi River, that part of the river that flows through what is now the state of Louisiana. As a matter of fact, in 1718, shortly after he became governor again, construction of the city of New Orleans begins. It's very slow. It's very difficult because it's in the middle of a swamp, for goodness sakes. The area of New Orleans that we know today as the French Quarter was the original New Orleans. And the reason why the French Quarter didn't flood during Katrina is that it's the highest ground in the entire city. And it's there because Bienville recognized that. Now, being high ground is a relative term, isn't it? It's not that far above sea level, but it is nevertheless higher than the surrounding swamps and marsh. So, the city of New Orleans was established in the year 1718. We celebrated its 300th anniversary 2 years ago. Uh, Progress was slow in building the city, but in a couple of years, it was sort of well established. It probably uh, was. People were convinced that it was going to continue to exist. Uh, in order to survive, a lot of drainage canals had to be dug uh, to, to carry the water away from the city, because even though it's high ground, it's not that high, right? Um, People began to build wharves and piers right there on the Mississippi River to load and unload ships that sailed up and down the river. They began to understand that a levee system was necessary to keep the city from flooding especially in the springtime, uh, when the level of the river really rose dramatically because of the snow melt in the northern parts of the North American continent that were drained by the Mississippi River. They began to install cemeteries. Of course, they almost immediately realized that they couldn't bury people in the ground because the water table was so high that they'd bury you one day, and 3 or 4 days later, they'd walk by and the body was on top of the ground. It floated, literally floated out of the ground. They created a town square that we now call Jackson Square, but which was at that time, and of course, my French, what's the word to describe my French? Stinks, okay? So if I don't do this exactly right, please forgive me up front. The Place d'Armes, the army place. It was the place in the original city of New Orleans where the militia would drill. It was a parade ground, if you will, and it later becomes Jackson Square. A church was built on the Place d'Armes, the St. Louis Cathedral. Now, once again, it never hurts to name your stuff after the king, does it? It's always nice to suck up to your boss. Um, the church that we now know as St. Louis Cathedral had its beginnings in the very earliest years. Now, it's burned 2 or 3 times since then and been rebuilt, but nevertheless, it's always been in that same spot. They built a number of government buildings and began to build warehouses in which to store things not only that were raised in Louisiana, but things which were being floated down the Mississippi River and needed to be stored until the next seagoing vessel would show. Now, who were these new colonists who were moving to the French colony of Louisiana? Well, some of them, it was a mixed bag. It was a mixed bunch. Some of them literally were convicts who were offered their freedom if they would get the heck out of France and go to Louisiana. Uh, and this included both men and women. Stories survive from that time period of men and women, French men and French women, uh, chained up and driven like cattle down to the boats that they would take in order to go to Louisiana. But even with them, it was still not enough colonists. Bienville understood that it simply wasn't enough. Poor people were kidnapped off the streets of French cities. And put on boats. There's a modern term to describe this. It's called Shanghai, right? You you'd be walking along the street down by the river, and somebody would come up behind you and knock you out with a stick. And when you woke up, pardon me, you were in a ship heading for Louisiana. The conditions on the ships were terrible. Now, in the 1720s, a different group makes its appearance in Louisiana. German and Swiss settlers began to come to Louisiana. Uh, Men, along with their wives and their children, they settled mostly in present day St. Charles and St. James parishes, and we still refer to that area where the Germans and the Swiss settled as the German coast. So quite often there's a reason that we call some of these things what we in fact call them, right? English turn, German coast. Uh, the casket girls, of course, came in. Around 1717, much to our shame and everlasting disgrace, the first African slaves made their appearance in the colony of Louisiana. And as a result, an entirely different set of laws was created to govern the behavior of the slaves. And they were called the Black Codes because of the color of the slave's skin. In French, the Code Noir, right? Noir, that means black. Okay, black codes, black laws. Most of these slaves came from Africa directly, most from the west coast of Africa. Some of them came from Caribbean islands, but they had come from Africa to begin with, right? And almost immediately after their arrival, the African slaves began to create their own Afro Creole culture. Now, let's talk about that word Creole for just a moment. That is a word that confuses even Louisianians, but it really confuses people who are not from Louisiana. The word Creole originally, in its original meaning, meant someone who was a pure-blooded Spaniard or a pure-blooded Frenchman who had been born outside of Spain or France. So, uh, if you had a pure Spanish daddy and a pure Spanish mama, but you were born in Louisiana, you were considered to be Spanish. That's true, but you were considered to be Creole. And that word simply meant you have pure European blood, but you were born in a place outside of Europe. Okay, that's the original meaning of the word. But a different meaning grew, and that's that when we talk about Creole cooking, pure old-fashioned traditional Creole cooking, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about European cooking with a Spanish or a French flair. Now, there's a second meaning for the word. And the second meaning of the word fundamentally is someone who is of a mixed race. I worked for years. A very dear friend of mine. His name, I know that he would not mind me mentioning his name in one of my lectures. His name was Lawrence Fontenot, and his grandparents uh, came from Louisiana to Texas and established a branch of the Fontenot family in Texas. Lawrence was a very light-skinned black man. And he considered himself not to be white and not to be black. He considered himself to be a Creole. Uh, and many Creoles, mixed race people, feel the same way. Now, mixed race. It doesn't have to be white and black, though. It could be black and Indian. Uh, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that a more modern day definition of a Creole is someone who is of mixed race, Generally, though, one of the races is black. Okay, now, uh, this African Creole culture begins to develop in Louisiana almost after right when the first slave got off the boat. Uh, those slaves were forced to accept European ways uh, when it came to their normal everyday lives because they were under the control of a white master or a white overseer. But when they had time of their own, which was limited, but when they did have time of their own, they did things the way they wanted to do it, and the result was a culture that was unique to them. It was we referred to as the Creole culture. Now we will get back to this topic uh, soon, but for right now, let's continue to talk about the overall growth of the French colony. A fort. Remember, the foundations of New Orleans were laid in 1718. The foundations of Natchitoches were old by this time. Um, Remember that Natchitoches was actually quite a bit older than New Orleans. So here's one of your quiz questions. New Orleans is the oldest city or town or municipality in what is now the state of Louisiana. And the answer to that is no, because the answer is Natchitoches. The colony continued to expand. A fort was built at Baton Rouge, right? Red Stick, in 1722. And another post was created at the present day location of Alexandria in 1723. And by 1744, there were about uh, 3,000 whites in the colony of Louisiana. Uh, Additionally, there were about 800 soldiers, and there were 2,000 slaves. So the slaves, even early in Louisiana's history, made up an appreciable percentage of the total population. Now, in 1725, Bienville is recalled to France, and he retires. He didn't do anything bad. He's just getting old by this time. And he was replaced with a new governor. His name was Etienne Perrier. Etienne is Etienne. And Etienne is the French equivalent of the name Stephen. Okay, so last name is Perrier, except it's Perier. So Stephen Perrier becomes the new governor of the French colony of Louisiana. Um, Something that Louisianians have enjoyed doing since the very beginning is arguing and bickering and fighting among themselves. Well, Perrier stopped all that. He stopped the factionalism and he stopped the bickering, and he did it the right way, though. He did it by being totally impartial. He didn't play favorites. No one could accuse him of playing favorites, and so things sort of settled down. There were Indian wars that took place during this time. Something that we tend to forget about is that every time a European came in, that means that an Indian is going to be pushed out. And the Indians always, to one degree or another, resisted the growth of the European population, and the result was war. And there was a series of wars fought between the French settlers, the French government, and the Indians in what is now Louisiana. Now, speaking of war, let's move a little bit forward in time. And let's get to 1754. By 1750, and now let's remember, let's not forget that another set of colonies coexisted with the French colony of Louisiana at this time. It, and those were the uh, English, the British colonies that were situated along the Atlantic seaboard of North America. Now, uh, remember that the French fear that the British might take over some of this land had led to the colonization of Louisiana. In 1754, uh, the war breaks out between the British and the French. And it is a war that we refer to as the French and Indian War because the Indians were involved in it. But it could be just as well be called uh, the French and British. It begins in 1754, French and Indian War, and it spread to Europe. It spreads to Europe, where it was not called the French and Indian War because there were no Indians. Uh, there, it was called the 7 Years' War. Uh, the French and Indian War started here. It was fought for 2 years before it made the transition across the Atlantic. And so it lasted 9 years here. It only lasted 7 years there. Here it was called the French and Indian War. In Europe, it was called the 7 Years. Same war. What did French government do in Louisiana to assist the French in fighting the French and Indian War? And the answer is simple. Not very much. Not very much. Um, the governor of the colony of Louisiana by that time was a fellow by the name of Traylor. Now, I'm sure that I am absolutely and totally massacring that name. So let me spell it for you. Kerlerec. Pronounce it the way you want to. Probably the way I did it was incorrect. But nevertheless, what I do know is that he was the governor at this time. And he begged the French government to send additional troops to Louisiana. But he said, when you send them, make sure they're not French. He said, the French soldiers that you've been sending me are terrible. Why don't you send some Swiss troops? The Swiss troops at that time were considered to be some of the best soldiers in Europe. He builds a defensive wall around New Orleans. He rebuilt some defenses south of the city near English Turn. But he did all this on his own. He did this of his own accord because the French government gave him no help, gave him no assistance. And as the years passed, and very little, if anything, was heard from France in the Louisiana colony, um, morale began to suffer. Discipline began to suffer. The war was affecting trade. British ships were at the mouth of the Mississippi River, keeping ships from leaving New Orleans, a French city, right, and going out into the Gulf. So trade was really being impacted. The economy was just going down the toilet. By 1757, the governor, however you pronounce his name, had not received any communication from France for more than 2 years. And in 1761, a French official, at least he had the courage to admit that France had sent no supplies to Louisiana for more than 4 years. Louisiana was on its own during the French and Indian War. Now, the war lasts 9 years in North America. Uh, the Treaty of Paris was signed between the French and the British, and it was the Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War here, right? The 7 Years' War there. And in the Treaty of Paris, France gives away. Oh, okay, let me do it this way. Back in those days, if you lost a war, you had to really pay a heavy price for losing. Quite often, you lost land. Sometimes you had to pay money as sort of a punishment for losing the war, but quite often you lost land. Well, that's exactly what happened to France. France loses land. Um, France, uh, into the Treaty of Paris, is written an agreement that France is going to lose all this land. But England doesn't want it. England, England. What else does England get in the Treaty of Paris? He gets Canada. That's big enough in the eyes of the British. They know that they're going to have enough trouble administering Canada. And they know that if they get all this French land west of the Mississippi River, it's just going to overburden them. And so they take it away from France, yes, but they give it to Spain. So Spain takes charge of all of the French land. Now, all of this French land is west of the Mississippi River with one exception. And that one exception is the city of New Orleans. The city of New Orleans is on the east bank of the Mississippi River. All the other land is on the west bank. Spain gets all of the land on the west bank and the city of New Orleans. And the French, I'm sorry, oh my, this is so confusing. I don't want to confuse you any further by misspeaking. The British take control of what had been Spanish Florida, right? So, what do the British now own as a result of the Treaty of Paris? Well, they own all of Canada. They own the original 13 colonies. And they own Florida, which now Florida today stops up over around Pensacola, Mobile, right? Not then. Back then, Florida went all the way to the Mississippi River. So, England owns all of Florida except for one important part of it. They don't own New Orleans. Spain owns New Orleans. So basically, France is eliminated from North America. Now, the French still own some islands in the Caribbean and things like that. But on the mainland, the presence of the French is over. Well, not quite. Everybody thinks so, but that's for a future lecture. But for right now, France is over. It's done with land possession on the North American continent. Now, so now the people of Louisiana, who have been French subjects for a long time, they now are subjects of the Spanish king. But the thing about it is that they're not told about this until late. And now the Treaty of Paris takes place in 1763. The French people of Louisiana don't get the news that they are now owned by Spain until 1764. And when they get the news, they are outraged. France transferred Louisiana, including, remember, what was Louisiana? It was all that land on the west side of the river and the city of New Orleans. Sometimes you hear it referred to as the Isle of Orleans. When you read that, when it's called that, understand that it's the city of New Orleans. France transfers Louisiana, including New Orleans, to Spain in 1762. The colonists were not informed until 1764. The last French governor, now this is weird now, and I'm not misspeaking, it takes a while for Spain to send a Spanish governor to Louisiana. And so the French governor is permitted to stay in office governing a territory that doesn't even belong to his country anymore. The last French governor was a man by the name of Jean Abadie, Abbadie. And he had very little, if any, respect for the people of Louisiana. He claimed that they were all lazy, that they were disobedient, that they drank too much, that they spent their money so freely that they were always broke and bankrupt. Spain did not actually take possession of Louisiana until 1766. The first Spanish governor was a man by the name of Antonio Ulloa, Ulloa. That double L quite often is pronounced as a Y. Okay, Ulloa. So there's been fundamental change in the ownership of much of the North American continent as a result of the French and Indian War. The French no longer own anything. Spain has had Florida taken away from them by the British, but they've been given Louisiana, including New Orleans. And the British now own Canada, and they own the original 13 colonies, and they own a lot of the land that is north of Florida. Now, during the French and Indian War, things had gone from bad to worse in Louisiana. Trade had declined, commerce had declined, the economy was in the toilet. Farmers and planters couldn't sell their crops because of the British blockade. The blockade by the British Navy down near the mouth of the Mississippi River. The British Navy wouldn't let anybody into the Mississippi River and wouldn't let anybody out of the Mississippi River. Even though Spain and France were both Catholic nations, they strongly disagreed on matters of religion. Most of the Spanish priests were Franciscans, while most of the French priests were Jesuits, and they despised each other. So just because they were Roman Catholic and Christian didn't mean that they had a group hug and got along together, because that was not the case. Now, when the people of Louisiana got the official word that they no longer belonged to France, but that they now belonged to Spain, they complained. And they tried to act. They sent delegates from Louisiana to Paris, back to France, encouraging the French government to take possession of Louisiana back, take it from the Spanish and take it back themselves. The colonial delegation went to see Bienville. Bienville was still alive, old, but he was still alive. They went to him to see if he would use his influence on getting Louisiana back into the possession of France. No, didn't work. As a matter of fact, Louis XV refused to even see them. He didn't even want to talk about it. And so the delegates returned to Louisiana, where the people are still outraged. This time they're mad at the French. They were mad at the Spanish, now they're mad at the French. They're mad at the French. They're especially mad at Louis XV because of his attitude. And people began to plot rebellion against the Spanish authorities. Now, Ulloa, Ulloa, is now he's the first Spanish governor of the colony of Louisiana. Excuse me. Ulloa arrives in the year 1766. From what little we know about him, he was probably not the best choice to be a colonial governor. He was small, he was nervous acting, he was easily excited. He was a scholar, okay? His training was not in government administration. He was an astronomer. He had founded an astronomical laboratory, an observatory back in France. Um, he only brought with him two companies of soldiers, probably at a max a couple of hundred soldiers. And he made some fundamental mistakes as the governor of Louisiana. He showed very little, if any, respect for local officials. He snubbed the social leaders of the colony. Look, if you're going to be a successful governor, you've got to have the important people on your side. And he didn't try to do that. In fact, he actively snubbed them. He got married, but he didn't get married in the city of New Orleans. Of course, it was just a little town by now, but it was all we had. It was the best we had. He got married in another little town in Louisiana called Belize, down near the mouth of the river. He ordered that the only people that the Spanish Louisiana, because they're Spanish Louisianians now, right? They might have French blood, but officially they're Spanish. He ordered that Spanish Louisianians could only trade with other Spanish people. They couldn't trade with the English. They couldn't trade with the French. They couldn't trade with any other nation of the world except for Spain. He limited uh, the ships that Louisiana goods were shipped in. It had to be a Spanish ship. It couldn't be an English ship. It couldn't be a French ship. And as a result, the merchants, who were probably the most important group of colonists, lost what little confidence they had in the Spanish. Now, he did try to do some good. We got to give him credit where credit is due. He prevented merchants from overcharging their customers. He encouraged immigration into the Louisiana colony by giving any immigrants free land, free livestock, free tools, free supplies for a year or so until they could get their feet on the ground, right? But opposition to Ulloa became so strong that the colonists finally forced him to leave the colony. And he left in 1768. And the colonists, once again, sent a delegation to Paris uh, in another attempt to convince Louis XV to take the Louisiana colony back. Once again, that failed too. There was a rebellion that takes place. Uh, and the Spanish government sends out a new Spanish governor. And his name, and he is Spanish, and he's a Spanish governor, but he has this Irish name. First name is Alejandro. Okay, that's a good Spanish name. But his last name is O'Reilly. Okay, obviously he had a Spanish mother who had married an Irish man and had the name of his daddy. His name was Alejandro O'Reilly. And he is a native Irishman. He had been a professional soldier. He was Spain's best military commander at that time. So Spain sends out a guy who is well equipped to put down this rebellion among well, it's hard to know what to call them, right? I mean, they're French blood, but they're Spanish subjects. So let's just call them the French, okay? To put down this French rebellion. He was smooth, he was courteous, and yet he was determined to obey the law and to obey the orders of the Spanish king. And the Spanish king had said, put down this rebellion. In addition, he brought 2,000 Spanish soldiers with him. He officially takes possession of the colony. He arrested the leaders of the rebellion. He gave amnesty to others, but he arrested the ones who were really the ringleaders. And he forced the people in and around New Orleans to take an oath of allegiance to Spain. Boy, that didn't go down very well with these former French subjects. But if they were going to live in Spanish Louisiana, they were going to have to do this. He tried. There was a trial for the leaders of the rebellion. Now, he was serious as cancer about this. 6 of the ringleaders were sentenced to be hanged as the trial ended. Others were given prison sentences. The property of all the ringleaders was confiscated. And in late 1769, 5 men were executed by firing squad. The 6th man who had been convicted was not executed because he had died in prison from some kind of disease. Okay. And when the former French subjects of Louisiana realized that Alejandro O'Reilly was serious, you didn't hear much from them in the future. He reorganized the colony of Louisiana. Excuse me, all this talking is making my throat. He helped revive trade and commerce. Remember, it had suffered so badly because the French had ignored Louisiana during the French and Indian War. O'Reilly helped revive trade. He helped revive commerce. He froze food prices so merchants couldn't gouge their customers. He reorganized the government. He was still in charge now. I don't want it to seem like he's this uh, easy guy. But he reorganizes government, makes it more efficient. And one of the things that he does when he reorganizes the government, he let Frenchmen keep their offices when it was possible. If they were doing a good job, he didn't just arbitrarily fire the Frenchman and hire the Spanish guy, right? He let the French keep their jobs if they were doing a good job. As a matter of fact, he went so far as to appoint a Frenchman as the lieutenant governor. He ordered a halt to the practice of enslaving the Indians. As a matter of fact, speaking of Indians, he signed additional treaties with the Indians. And historians argue over whether he tried to keep the terms of those treaties or not, but at least on paper, he tried. He sent most of his army back to Havana, right? Once things settled down and he realized that the army was no longer needed, he sent it back. And he replaced the Spanish army with members of a Louisiana militia. And the Louisiana militia was commanded by local men. He asked for more priests in the colony. Of course, these would be Franciscans, right? French farmers who had received title to their land from the French government, as you can well imagine, were very nervous when the Spanish took over because they didn't know if the Spanish would recognize their titles to the land. Well, they need not have worried because O'Reilly helped what was referred to as proving the titles to their land. So if you were a Frenchman who owned land, You still own your land, except now you're a Spaniard. He leaves the governorship in the spring of 1770, and considering that he was uh, not governor that long, he made a lot of positive changes, changes for the good in the colony of Louisiana, and he was replaced by a man by the name of Luis, Luis, Louis, right? Unzaga, Unzag. Now, Gonzaga, as it turned out, was a fine governor. He was a professional military man. He liked the French people of Louisiana. Um, Being the governor of Louisiana was not his first government position. As an administrator, he was a veteran of the Spanish colonial system that existed around the world. He continued the practice of naming Frenchmen to be uh, government officials. Um, Even though uh, it was against the law to trade with British Florida, remember, Florida is right. Remember, I didn't finish my thought a while ago. Today, Florida stops between Pensacola and Mobile. Back then, Florida went all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. All that land was owned by the British by now, except for the city of New Orleans. And it was illegal for the Spanish to trade with the British, who were right across the river. Gonzaga sort of looked the other way. It was their closest trading partner. And Gonzaga said it doesn't make any sense not to trade to the people who are nearest to you geographically. He encouraged the growing of tobacco. Tobacco was becoming a very popular crop up in Virginia and Maryland in the British colonies. Gonzaga thought that maybe, just maybe, it would do the same thing in Louisiana. So he used government funds to buy tobacco. They planted it and encouraged more tobacco growing. He organizes the first public school in Louisiana. It wasn't much, and it didn't last long, but at least he's making the attempt. He strengthened the new militia that Alejandro O'Reilly had created. Uh, he sided with the Americans when the American Revolution begins. And that's going to be something that's really important, and we'll talk about that in quite some depth uh, soon, probably uh, the next lecture, maybe starting this one and finishing in the next lecture. He made a conscious effort to heal the wounds, the disagreements between the French and the Spanish in Louisiana by encouraging marriages between French and Spanish brides and grooms. He was such a good governor that he was promoted and transferred. Uh, Sometimes back in those days, you got transferred because you stunk, but not him. He was good at what he did, and he was promoted in 1776 and transferred to Venezuela into a much more important job. And when he leaves the governorship, probably the most famous of all of the colonial governors takes his place. A man by the name of Bernardo de Galvez becomes the next governor of Spanish Louisiana. Galvez, Galvez. All right, that's a really worked out nicely. That's a uh, let's continue to talk about Galvez. We've got another 10 minutes before our hour is up here, so let's do that. Um, Galvez was a very young man when he became the governor of Louisiana. He was in his 20s. He had been born in Spain from a very powerful and important political family. He had entered the army in his teens and had distinguished himself in a war against Portugal. He had been transferred to the New World, and he had become an Indian fighter. He became famous as he fighting the Apache tribe in the American Southwest. As a matter of fact, he had been badly wounded with arrows and spear. He had been transferred to North Africa and got involved in a war there that Spain was conducting. He had been wounded there as well. And so he was a bona fide, Galvez was a bona fide war hero. And he was transferred to Louisiana and became the governor of the Spanish colony. Now, Galvez had some orders from the Spanish government in Madrid. He was ordered, and this is in no order of importance, all right? It's just a list of the things he was ordered to do. He was ordered to take a census. Nobody knew exactly how many people lived in the colony. He was ordered to prepare a financial statement. Where does the colony of Louisiana stand financially? What are our debts? What are our assets? Right? He was encouraged to welcome foreigners, to encourage foreigners to immigrate to Spanish Louisiana if they would become Catholics and if they would take an oath of allegiance to Spain. If you did those two things, you were absolutely welcome. He was ordered to encourage agriculture. Remember, this was an agricultural society. There was no industry anywhere. So if you were going to be successful financially, you were going to have to make sure that you did it agriculturally. He was also ordered to make sure that the slaves were well treated. He was ordered to help end smuggling. Now, remember, Spanish and the British in Florida, or they're trading back and forth, and both of them sort of like it. Although it's illegal for both of them to do it, quite often, if you can make a profit, you sort of forget about what the law is. Well, he was ordered to end the smuggling, and he didn't really take that too seriously. He was ordered to maintain a good relationship with the Indians who still lived in Louisiana. He was also ordered to keep an eye on the British who were in Florida. He was ordered to strengthen the Louisiana militia. And what was the result? He did his best to obey his orders. He did a better job in some areas than in other areas, but generally he tried to obey his orders. So here are the results. He did. He lowered taxes on items that were being shipped out of the colony. He increased legitimate trade with the British. Now, what that means is that he was trading with the British North American colonies, the 13 colonies over on the Atlantic. It was still illegal to trade with the British colony of West Florida. He did conduct a census. By the way, there were about 18,000 people living in the colony about that time, and almost half of them were African slaves. He did, in fact, encourage immigration. He gave each settler, who, remember, you had to agree to become a Catholic and take an oath of allegiance to Spain. And if you did that, you were welcome in Louisiana. He gave each settler about 5 acres of land. He gave each settler an axe, a sickle, a spade, a hoe, 2 pigs, 2 hens, a rooster, and food for a year. In other words, he recognized that being a new settler was extraordinarily difficult, and he tried to make it easy, not easy, easier for them by at least providing them with the tools that they needed and some fundamental livestock that they needed in order to make a go of it. As a result, uh, people from Spain began to immigrate to Louisiana. But in addition to the people who actually lived in Spain, There was another uh, group of Spaniards who didn't live in Spain. They lived in the Canary Islands. The Canary Islands were owned by Spain. And as a result, the people who lived in the Canary Islands, and you can look at it, is that in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa, right? The people who lived in owned the Canary Islands were just as Spanish as anybody else. Many of the people from the Canary Islands began to move to Louisiana. And the descendants of those Canary Islanders, which we refer to as about the Spanish name, the Islenos, right? People from the islands, right? That's what that means. There are still a lot of Islenos who live in Louisiana, especially down in Plaquemines and St. Bernard Parish. Some of you have had or will have Dr. Samantha Perez for one of your history courses. Dr. Perez, right? Spanish name. Dr. Perez is an Isleno from down around St. Bernard, except of course, she pronounces it St. Bernard. a brilliant, a brilliant scholar. I recommend her to you highly. A lot Germans continued to move into Louisiana. There was already that little German colony north of New Orleans, the German coast, right? And so people like to be around people just like themselves, and so the Germans continued to move into that area. And after the American Revolution was over, a lot of Americans who had been loyal to England moved to Louisiana, as well as British refugees moved here as well. Now, 57 minutes. Okay. I don't want to start the next thought and then have to interrupt it in the middle. So I'm gonna stop this right now. Okay. Okay. So this is the end of lecture number 2. And I will pick it up again, continuing our conversation of Bernardo de Galvez and his role in the American Revolution. All right, folks. See you soon.